You got the full thing for yourself.
I know, I can't believe it. I should talk about models and everything that you hate.
Okay, that's it. For that, I will take you through the initial part because you came in late. We have discussed this whole theme, which of course is in, you've received the email and all, and it's on the posts. But the theme basically started off with the definition in the Singapore Convention, only because of the fact that we have a universal discussion definition out there. So the process, whatever name you give it, however it is conducted, and the fact being that the person doesn't have the authority to impose a decision. So these were the aspects that came out from that decision. So it was a broad thing that the models and all is not really affecting the whole definition of mediation, but it's your show. You take it the way you want
It's
to.
my show, and I'm going to tell you that it has, even the word and the use of models is very cultural.
Yeah, please.
So it has to be discussed.
Absolutely.
Because if you're going to talk about mediation in the US, you have to talk about this whole invention of models. And so what I did actually was start looking at where did this all happen? Because if you go back to, okay, what were the antecedents? Because we know mediation, or a form of mediation, or collaborative processes have been around for ages. What's new is law, relatively. And that's what we forget, that the whole concept of law and the legal system was a newer invention and replaced a lot of the collaborative systems. So I found that really interesting. And then I was looking at, well, why did that happen? And so if you look at why did the legal system take over this collaborative system, it's because there were a lot of inequalities in the collaborative system, because there were biases that favored the elite or favored other groups. And so collaborative system didn't create fairness. So the whole idea of law was to capitalize on this idea of fairness and what is fair. And law itself has the judge is kind of an intermediary. It goes back to that whole idea of that you should bring it to somebody in charge and they'll help make a decision. So we go back to ancient Sumeria for that. In a way, that came from mediation. So law itself derived from mediation, in my opinion. I'm not going to say that 100%, but that's what I'm reading and what I'm sort of theorizing now, and I'm still working on that. So looking at that, then how did we come back to mediation or a collaborative system when we left it? And so I looked in the US particularly, and this happened around the late 1800s and early 1900s with a lot of social and labor unrest. So it started because there was a lot of workers were feeling that they weren't getting paid fairly. There wasn't fairness in the system, and they wanted to create labor unions, and they started bargaining. So this came directly from the collective bargaining, because there was a lot of violence and unrest within the society. And then the collective bargaining helped to reduce that violence. And so that was the beginning of it. And the whole system of a model came from somebody, a woman named Betts, I've forgotten her first name, but she developed the model. I mean, that's why I said even models are part of our culture, because one of the things that Western societies did was study what's working and then put it into a system, create a system from it. Look at what's working, create the steps, and then teach it to someone else. So that whole idea of a model, that's what a model is. A model is studying what's being done, putting it into steps and then teaching somebody else. So that's how that model came. And then there was a whole model, a 7-step model for collective bargaining. That led to the 7-stage model of mediation. And mediation was adopted because the courts were overwhelmed. So the courts actually in the US stimulated the beginning of mediation in the US. So I think, wow, isn't that interesting? I didn't know that. And the whole reason was because they were overburdened and they saw that the collective bargaining worked. So let's have a system of using that and creating something that will help so that we can look at other social problems. So it's like, that is so fun. I never knew that. So let me look at my notes. So where I am. All right, so this happened. So mostly mediation came around the mid 1940, 1941. Although there was conciliation that started in 1913. So there was the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service that started again out of that whole idea in the courts. And conciliation and that model that was more directive was created from that. So that's why I do PowerPoint, so I have notes, so I remember what I was going to say. So that whole system started developing then. What I found interesting really was that Ohio, which is the state I live in, was one of the states that drove mediation and encouraged mediation in general. It was with this whole idea that there was a prosecutor in Columbus, Ohio, and he looked at the court and he thought there has to be other ways to solve the problems. And again, it had been successful and we had started this movement earlier. And he said, okay, maybe there should be alternative ways. And I want to say, because he said alternative dispute resolution. So everything was not about mediation, even in the beginning. It was about finding alternatives to the court that will work, that can solve the problems before they get to court, or in addition to the court, to help the system so that it's not backed up. And so that's where it started becoming popular. That was also the beginning of community mediation, because then the federal government got involved, funding became available, and they started looking at what other alternatives to the court system can we use. And mediation was the first and most popular example, but we also started with restorative justice later on, which is also popular and is part of that umbrella of mediation, even though we don't talk about it as much. But we have the family group decision-making, all of those indigenous methods that come from other areas like New Zealand. Family group decision-making comes from New Zealand, was adopted in the US. And then the Native American circle process was adopted in the US under restorative justice, dating back to, actually it was Canadian who introduced the circle process. And that became part of restorative justice and is being used very heavily in Minnesota for a lot of their court processes, as well as reentry and people coming out of the court system. In fact, there's the Judge Barry White who started this. He was sitting, and he always tells the story. I remember that he was sitting out camping one night, and he looked around at the campfire and everyone sitting around roasting marshmallows, and he thought, I sentenced every one of these guys to prison. And here I am with them, as an equal. And this is, result of what the circle process did. And I found that very powerful, that the alternative systems not only have the power of resolving some of the issues, but also have the power of bringing the community together. And I think that that's also part of what the charm of mediation is as well, as one of the alternative systems. So looking at that, I get excited about it. And we call them all models, but they weren't models. They were just systems that were in place. And again, part of the Western way of doing things is to study it and then put it into a process to teach others so that it's more formalized. And so that formalization is part of Western culture in general. Okay, so next, I hate talking. And I have the floor. I'm so much better in conversation. Okay. So all of this was happening around the 1970s in the US, going into the historical context. Again, the Department of Justice did a lot of funding, particularly for community mediation centers. There were also private mediators that were part of this process. I think there was a heavy emphasis in the beginning of mediation on community centers because the idea was to try to give power to the communities. But they also started, the Department of Justice also started these neighborhood justice centers, which also involved more than just mediation, but looking at what are the social problems in these communities and how we can solve them. So everything centers around here's the problem or the issue, how can we solve it, what kind of methods can we use, what kind of ways can we as a community solve these issues and these problems. So mediation is one of those. Again, some of the restorative justice ideas are other parts of it, but it all is about centered around trying to solve the social issues within the community. In terms of the courts also reached out to private mediators, and there's a kind of a division between the private mediators and the courts, and there's also a tension and a competitiveness on who's going to get the dollars signed. So we do have that in the US, that push and pull. I'm going to talk about push and pull a lot in that because there's a value of what you're offering to the community, but then there's also that value of how do we value the person. Community mediation centers use volunteers, and professional mediators or private mediators don't like that because they feel like it devalues their worth. And so there's that conversation that happens in the US between community mediation and professional mediation. One of the issues, in my mind, community mediation is not really free, even if you use a volunteer who may not be paid. And some community centers do provide money for their mediators. Others don't. It depends on the community. But they get dollars, and that mediation is valued at a dollar amount from the grants that they get. So it's not free. So nothing is free. And that's what should be promoted for professional mediators. I think that the courts tend to give private mediators more, I would say, legally intricate cases, and community mediators tend to get cases that are more involved with the relationship. So I think that's one major difference, but not always, because a lot of community mediation centers go beyond that. So I do talk a lot about community mediation, but that's my experience. One of the things that I do like, because Ohio was one of the first, they also have the system where they train all of their mediators through the Ohio Supreme Court. And we, any mediators provided access to any free training that the courts offer. So you can get divorce mediation, you can get for every different type of mediation that comes through the doors, you can get training for that if you're a mediator that's registered with the Supreme Court of Ohio, and you get it free. There is some cases that require dollar amounts, but for the most part, there's a lot of training that is free of charge. So keeping yourself up to date and with whatever the latest methods are is still part of that. So I'm going to look at my notes. Where was I? Maybe I should just have people ask me questions, since that's what I'm best about. So I wanted to talk about also the cultural influences on the mediation process, because I feel like culture, it's not just why is mediation attractive? What is the culture in the US that attracted it? One is that independent thinking. There's values of independence. There's values of it's kind of like there's a saying in the US, you don't like to air your dirty laundry to somebody in the community. And so this idea of using mediators that are not known, or in general, there's an emphasis on choosing someone. You don't choose your mediator necessarily. If it goes through the court, one is assigned to you. You can choose if you're going to a private mediator. That's not that it doesn't happen, but oftentimes it is assigned. And the idea is that you should have somebody you don't know, because that helps to provide an unbiased approach. If you don't know either person's story, you're not going to be biased towards one person or the other. And thank you. Prabhat is going to ask a question and help me.
Not right now. Only when I get him in. Right now, he's not his point to get
Oh,
in. Later,
okay.
There's so much more, because we'll take it in a certain direction, which I don't want. I want you to tell us things that there are so much that we don't know about. In terms of, you can
I don't
elaborate.
know what you don't know about. I think everyone here knows so much.
No, you're assuming that. The point is that if you want to elaborate on the models, you want to elaborate on restorative justice, please go ahead. Please elaborate. Think that we know nothing. No one knows anything about this. Then you, of course, you can, of course, the indigenous communities and all that, you can also just elaborate as much as you can.
So from my standpoint, in the cultural point of view, culture influences the mediator and what the mediator chooses or how the mediator chooses to practice. Culture influences the parties and what the parties want, and culture influences just the whole reason or why we would use mediation, or why we might like one model or process over another. Those are all the things in my mind that culture influences. So there are two parts of culture also that influence mediation. One is the communication process. So for me, okay, as an intercultural communication specialist, the two things I have learned are the two places where we have the most influence in any culture are what processes we use to communicate, and also then what are our values. And you see our values in even the ways that we think about it. I think yesterday when Ken was talking, I heard people talk about, okay, So confidentiality, that's a value. And that's a value that gets put into mediation. And that's, again, part of that, not wanting to have your dirty laundry, having the feeling that, okay, I can talk about it because outside of this room, nothing is going to go beyond. It's not going to be talked about in the community. So that value gets installed in the processes that we're using. Another value is, let's see, what else did I hear? This problem solving and negotiation, that I heard, and that goes back to the whole reason, because this came out of collective bargaining. So mediation itself in the West has a lot to do with negotiation. And I heard the language like, well, you can even negotiate relationships. So that whole idea of negotiation, that whole culture is put into mediation, and that idea that it's a negotiation of relationships. It's not necessarily that we are negotiating relationships. I'm going to say something that in general, whatever we believe, our beliefs then get, and Ken alluded to this yesterday, whatever we believe, our beliefs get confirmed. We confirm it ourselves. So we then we have a bias towards it. And I mean, this is one thing that Vikram brings up a lot. So I do, recognize that that's true, that our whole systems, that become biased because we learned it in a certain way. And I think it is a skill to be able to move in and out, because to learn something, sometimes it's good to observe, maybe learn what are those processes people are using, but also to be able to learn to move back away from it and look at something else and bring it in and not get attached to it. I think one of the issues that we have a lot of times in mediation is we become attached to what we've been taught. And that attachment then makes it difficult. So if you look at the historical context of mediation in the US and the fact that it was based on negotiation, we use a lot of language about negotiation. We use a lot of that value of negotiation comes forward in the mediation process. Is that the only process? And I'm going to talk about that later when I talk about transformative. Because everything we believe, if we believe that the parties, for instance, have the skill to resolve their own disputes, we'll use a different process. If we believe they need help, we're going to direct them more. So what we believe about the parties, that's also important. Everything we believe, every aspect of culture is involved in the process wherever we are. And I think this point that colonialization has that effect on collaborative systems, this is true, because we've installed something new or something different and then taken over that thinking. So how can we use our skills to say this is a good thing, but then there's also things here that can be used? And what we should look at, in my opinion, is look at what do we want to accomplish and how can we use the best of all the systems to accomplish that. So it's about using an intentional process and knowing what our intention is, but also knowing what we believe about others, and knowing what our values are. So, all right. So if I talk more about that process. So for me, again, other values, the other value that I did not put in my PowerPoint that I think is also important is the value of being voluntary. And you see that a lot in the US right now. There's this whole thing about masks and mask wearing or not getting vaccinated because people don't like to be told what to do and they don't want to mandate. And that's part of our culture. And the same thing comes into mediation. That's why we want a voluntary process, because if people are told you have to go mediate, they're going to resist that. And that comes back to the whole way that the US was developed. Individualism started actually because of the pandemic. I don't think it was chickenpox, but I think it was there was a major plague. There was the plague that was going throughout Europe, and that plague was so devastating that people then had to pull back and do things on their own. And that doing things on their own and moving away from the community resulted in a lot more individualism. And in the US, we're a very individualistic culture. This whole movement of moving away from Europe, moving to the US, and then moving through the West, being independent and taking care of yourself and your family, that became a very strong value. And that's in mediation, in that whole idea of it being voluntary. So we come to that when we have a court system, or when the courts mandate mediation, then we have again, a push and a pull, because the mandate challenges the value of independence. So one of the ways that my area and we handle it is the courts will mandate a mediation, for instance, for child protection or a divorce. And what we will do is, and the courts agree to this, that if you come to mediation, that's all that you're required to do. You are not required to go forward. You can say, okay, I'm here. I require, I have complied to the court, but I don't want to mediate, and then it can go back to the court. So in a way, it's not in their best interest. So usually they'll choose to have mediation because it's a better process because they have more of a say in the process. But that voluntariness is built into the system. You should have let him ask questions. I like it when other people are driving and I don't want to drive. Okay. So confidentiality, I mentioned that. Fairness is another big value in the US, so that gets built into the system. I mean, that was the whole reason for mediation in the first place, because they wanted fairness in the labor disputes and the labor issues. And one of the things that I think, and this is a push and a pull also, because the newer models don't have that, but I think that in general in culture, we want to know what's going on. To make a decision, you want to have all the information and know what's going on. And so the model, this is why the problem-solving facilitative model is very popular, because the mediator has a little bit of control over the process and gets the information to make the decisions. Self-determination is the other value that I think is very important, and should be recognized for mediation, because I think there's a really heavy Western value of being able to make up your own mind and decide on your own, which is what mediation has brought to the table, that the parties get to decide where they want to go, what they want to do, how they want to solve it. And again, the transformative model, which I'll talk about in a little bit more, takes that a little bit further, because they say, okay, should the mediator make the process decisions? Like if I decide who's going to talk first, then I have influenced the mediation, because the first person who talks, actually the research shows that the first person who talks, first person who tells their story, has an advantage over the second person. So this also happens in the court. So how do you decide who should go first or who should go next? In the transformative model, the mediator shouldn't make those decisions, let the parties make the decisions about how they want to talk, what they want to talk about, and even what information they want to give. And that is because you're giving more power to the parties. So that's more self-deterministic a model than the problem-solving model. Let's see, what else? I wish I should have thrown quotes in, or, you know, or maybe sing a song in the middle so you're all not bored.
I said this is your 1 hour. You can do what you like. You dance if you want to. Bollywood
Oh,
songs,
I can dance.
we can play Bollywood songs if you want. But you have no one's coming in, because every time you have this issue, someone cuts you off. Today, no one's going to cut you off.
I don't mind if people cut me off. I like conversation. You know why I'm a mediator? Because I like conversation.
But you like the conversations when you're told to speak. But at the moment you are not told to speak, you don't want the.
Okay, so even the types of disputes are, you know, also like, I think that's also very cultural. I mean, we have neighborhood disputes which are about your tree is hanging over on my yard, you know, like, okay, that to me a very cultural thing, because we have this idea of personal property. That's a cultural value. We have this idea that, you know, we don't want interference. We want to be able to have our life and have it go the way it is. And so those disputes, those kinds of disputes come up in the community. This is why the courts like mediation, because they don't want to handle these things. They're like, let somebody in the community figure this out so we don't have to do it. Because like Brazil, the US is probably one of the most litigious societies. And this idea that everything should go to the court, I mean, it goes to the court in a heartbeat. And a lot of times the cases don't even have any value. Some of the times people are trying to take issues to the court that don't have value, that are more of those disputes. And those are really well handled by community mediation centers. So a lot of the courts like to work with community mediation centers on those. The private mediators tend to take more of the higher end civil cases, the divorce cases, or things like, okay, one of the popular ones in the US is you have a lemon car. And so if you get a car that's not working, that becomes a big deal. And so there's a whole process of mediating for your car that's not doing well. There lemon laws for cars. So those legal issues become very complex, and they're very popular mediation these days. So all the types of cases are very cultural. Not sure whether, so that's it. And that's in general, the way that those cases work. I feel like the new model, so for me, the direction of mediation is towards the newer models, which are transformative model is one of the newest models. It still is, there's a push and a pull, like I said before, because transformative mediation is relational. It's not about the transaction. The problem-solving model is about the transaction and heavily biased towards negotiating everything, and finding, you know, what is in the best interest. But the mediator directs the process. And one of the issues that came out of that is, if the mediator is directing the process, I can influence the decision by the questions I ask the parties as a mediator. And I definitely know that because I was really good at getting agreement. I used to get 99% agreement in all of my mediations. And so I know it was how well, because I've done both problem solving and transformative, it was how well I asked the questions and what I put on the table that got agreement. So this idea of agreement is heavily into the problem-solving model. The transformative model says, why are we looking for agreement? Why are we looking for all the parties to agree? Because the dispute itself, we're not going to know in 1.5 hours or 2 hours what's been going on for 6 months. We don't know all the elements of the mediation. And so we should be comfortable with not knowing. Instead, we should let the parties decide every issue of it. And even if they decide that they don't want to finish the mediation, that they want to end and get no agreement, we should be comfortable with that, because that may be a better resolution. Because sometimes I know in my experience, sometimes I've gotten an agreement and it didn't last. And it didn't last because it probably shouldn't have been there in the first place. So it is better to let the parties decide that. And if they go to court, maybe that's a better solution, because sometimes it is a better solution that people resolve it in court. It's not necessary that the best solution is a mediation. It should be on the table. So transformative looks at that. It also says everyone, every single person, we live every day. We resolve disputes every day. Every single person, even the lowliest person, is able to resolve disputes. But the problem is that when they're angry, when they get into this emotional impasse, this is an emotional issue. And if we can help them through that issue, then they themselves can find their own way to resolve the dispute. So that's basically what it's saying. This new stuff about emotional intelligence also supports that, with the research that shows that people can switch and then solve the dispute and come up with solutions. So the transformative model works on helping people transform the issue from where they're feeling like they can't think of a solution to where they can move back and then think of the solution on their own. And that what we're finding is that people are more likely to adhere to the solution when they have had more of the ability to determine it. But the push and pull is between that, especially for mediators, it's, you know, the willingness to let go and be relational, because as a culture, because we're so individualistic and so pragmatic, it's difficult for us as mediators to let go of the control of the process. Right? At least we can control the process. We'll let this person speak. They don't know what they're doing. No, we're going to help them out. Using that language, help them out, says, you know, that we assume that people need help. But what if they don't need help? What if the only help that they need is to figure out, is to get away from the emotional impact of where they are to being able to be more calm and more clear and make the decision? Maybe that's the only help. Maybe they don't need help in resolving the dispute. So that's what transformative mediation says. So in general, now you can ask questions. I think I may have talked for an hour, a whole hour. Hello, everybody in YouTube. I hope you're not terribly bored. Turn on the questions, Vikram. I'm done.
I
Okay,
have
so
one.
I
I have one question on the chat box.
You want to say it out, or should I read it out?
Yeah,
Okay,
please, have me.
It says, in terms of mediation process in the USA, you are provided full accountability for results of mediation program. Senior leadership support, both judicial and political. Effective oversight by board of governors or a similar entity. Provide full-time qualified mediation center director. Provide full-time qualified judge coordinator for referrals. Is there any disadvantages? Have you read the chat? The question in the chat? You want to elaborate on it? Are you okay with it, Lisa? Or you want him to elaborate?
Okay, so basically, there is in the U.S. there is a law that the Uniform Mediation Act, and that again started in Ohio. I told you Ohio is really big in this. And but mediation is a little bit more complex, because one of the things that we have is that we have this, every state also develops its own processes. So every state also approaches mediation differently. Every state has different rules and laws about how to approach mediation. One of the things is that it is understood that there is nothing to bind the parties to a mediation agreement. So unless it goes to the courts, and then the judge will, like when we do a mediation, for instance, a divorce mediation, then the agreement that the parties have is taken to the courts, and then the judge will say, okay, now this is the court decree, and then it's binding. So it depends on the mediation itself. The belief is that if the parties agree to it, they're more likely to automatically do it, because when two people voluntarily agree, the tendency is, and the behavior is, that they tend to, okay, now I've shaken your hand, I'm probably gonna, do it. So we find that, 80 or 90% of the time, the parties will willingly adhere to their agreement. But if it needs an extrajudicial decree, then the process that goes through the courts is that the judge will then make that a decree. And that also works like in the case of divorce agreements, and particularly around children. The way that that works is that and this is one of the things I tell my parties, that if you are getting along, let's say that there was a child divorce, and there was a visitation agreement that the child goes here on these days, and then the other days, and on holidays you get the child, and that's the way that the decree works. But if the parties agree otherwise and they're not in conflict, they have the freedom to do it that way. It only is a problem if they get into conflict, it falls back to the agreement. I don't know if that makes sense. So that's true of most agreements. Like if the two parties agree on something else and they get along, then they can still do that as long as they agree, and as long as it's within the law.
Nam, is it okay?
I think that the Lisa's answer is satisfied, but let me just take this opportunity to tell you what we expect to have the culture in Vietnam. We very envious with you, because in the mediation culture in the States is very strong. Why in Vietnam, as I released that information earlier today, that in Vietnam we haven't got created enough the mediation culture in Vietnam. So that's why now our expectation now is we would like to have more dispute that's settled by mediation and more successful mediation. We expect to have more mediator, more training. And then I think that it takes a long time for us to come closer to the real goals of the mediation. That means in order to reduce the burden of litigation. That means in Vietnam, people still focus on litigation, and then the mindset about mediation is still very, very limited. Even now, in the United States, you have the Uniform Act of Mediation Act. In Vietnam, we do have the same. We just have the law. I mean, the acts on cost and next mediation. However, when the parliament itself enacted that law, and that takes a long time to go into the mindset of the community. So that's why the community, they even do not have an idea. So that's why I think that step by step we have to create the what we call the culture of using the mediation in our society.
But now, what are you going to
Yeah.
talk about when you are the speaker? Right now, it's Lisa's
No,
turn to tell us.
I think this discussion is valuable because I mean, I will tell you, even though that we have a lot of mediation, and it's also because the mediations, I do professional mediation, I mean private mediation, but I'm also connected to a community mediation center. And I really believe in what we can do for the community. But even in that center, we struggle with, and it's run by the city, it's promoted by the city. We put out a lot of information, but even in that, a lot of people don't know about mediation. The second thing is, and this is a cultural value, people don't like in the US, they don't want to go to somebody else to resolve their problems. They want to feel like they can resolve it themselves. And I think this is just a human value, that we all want to feel like we can resolve it ourselves. And we also don't want to let other people know what's going on. So those two things make mediation difficult to sell. And so I think it's, going to take time to make it as a regular process, or to get people to feel comfortable with it, because nobody wants to say, oh, I went to a mediation, like, oh, what was wrong with you? So that's another problem. I think those are common problems with just human beings in general.
But Lisa, are you going to
Thank you.
throw any light on the historical aspect of it? Anything on the indigenous communities or anything like that? Are you throwing more light on that?
Indigenous communities have always, had their own processes. And that's the thing. Like, if you look at Native Americans, they had their circles that they came together and they talked about. And this is one of the reasons that it was adopted in Canada and then moved to the US, what they call the circle process, because they would sit in a circle. And the advantage of a circle process is that everyone is equal in the circle, even the judge. So that gets to that value of equality. There's not if you look at the court is also designed in a way where the judge is up at the top and other people are down below. And the judge will say, who gets to talk, kind of like Vikram, and who doesn't get to talk. I had to tease him. But that value is there. But if you want to have equality, and the way that a circle process works is that you take some kind of symbol, something what they call a talking piece. So it'll be a symbol of what you are believing in. Could be an eagle feather, because an eagle sees far and wide in the indigenous culture. And you pass that around one person at a time, and then they have the ability to say whatever they want to say. And so sometimes what happens in that process is that by the time it gets around to the fourth person, they might be really angry, but some of their issues may have been addressed before it gets to them. And then they have something else to add. And so you do this on many rounds and many circles. And then it starts to, a solution within the community starts to evolve from that, from those discussion points. I love the circle process because of that. We've been able to, I've talked about diversity issues, some very intense and difficult issues. It's easier to have a conversation about a high level dispute in that process. It does have its problems and other issues, because sometimes bias gets in the way of being able to have the conversation in the right way. But it's a highly spiritual process as well. So that's a little bit about more of the indigenous and particularly Western indigenous processes, because I think even the idea of democracy, some people believe that it came from Native Americans, that our whole system of government was modeled after what we saw in terms of the way that the indigenous people met and how they organized their culture. And then, and then we killed him. So, sorry. Okay, so I was looking at full-time qualified judge coordinator. What did you mean? Nam?
Nam, you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean that I believe that full time here, that mean there are two kinds of mediator. We have the how to say, the mandatory mediator, and we have the private one, right? And then I think that probably that is about the first one. That means if in order to serve the court and next mediation, then of course we need the permanent people who got the salary and then who do the mediation job. However, in Vietnam, I think that we have the tendency now is what we call the private mediation. That, for example, our Vietnam Mediation Center, that we can only get the fee if we are chosen by our client. But in the other the process, we call it the court annex mediation. Let's say that the people working for that mediation section, they are the permanent clerk or judges at the court, and so we call it full time.
Mm.
But,
Yeah,
no.
I mean, here in the U.S., so I mean, there are some judge mediators, or some, and as we have the whole range of models, it's not just one. Like I said, it's different in different states or even different cities or jurisdictions. So we do have some judges that like to mediate. Some people believe that the judges are not as unbiased as they would like to see the judges be. So there's that issue in terms of the judges. In some where they have community mediation centers, they partner with the court and they have a coordinator, and the coordinator decides who's going to mediate. And sometimes they try to match, especially in the community, they try to match community members that they think will work well with a certain ethnic group, or because we have a lot of ethnic groups within the US. So they look at those issues. One interesting fact that I should point out is I also practiced in Nebraska, and the Nebraska Community Mediation Center trains all of the mediators in Nebraska. So if you want to be, even if you know mediation, you're a practiced mediator, you have to go through the Nebraska training in order to be a mediator in Nebraska. So again, states, define who's going to be a mediator. So in the state of Nebraska, you take mediation training from the Community Mediation Association, and then you can be a mediator. One of the things they did find in research is that the participants prefer private mediators because their perception is that a private mediator is better because they're a private mediator. Although it's not necessarily true, but that's a perception of the public. So I find that interesting.
But Lisa, basically now we got discussed a lot on the court system part of it, but in general, what is the mindset towards mediation? Can you just maybe discuss that part?
Oh, yeah. Yes, yeah.
I think that, the reason I think we did the courts is because I find that one of the things is that there's a perception that community mediation is separate, but in the US, it's very intricately involved with the courts. It started with that, and it has a lot of that. But community mediation centers also, because it also started with social unrest, they also work on looking at other social problems and how can we resolve problems within the community. So they might use facilitation, have larger discussions, like in the city of Dayton, they do city planning and they use a mediation center for city planning. Or for, like, I think I was telling someone that they decide how they're going to spend the dollars for the COVID relief. That is also, they call for it on the mediation center, and they have mediators come out and have that discussion. Pravat has his hand up, and he has been so patient, and you didn't let him ask a question before.
No, we are
so
going to
I
get
am
him in.
patient.
He'll have the last word. He'll have the last word. Please,
Why
Pravat,
does he
please.
get the last word?
Because you don't
Sorry.
want to finish. Someone else
No,
has to
no.
get the last word.
No, actually, Lisa, the first time when there was a mark there, it was not a raising of hand. It was actually clapping. That was an emoji. But however, I wanted to ask you a question. Yes. So thanks, Vikram, for this. And thanks, Lisa. I think you've so brilliantly and so lucidly explained the ecosystem in the US. As most people talk, that US seems to be the pioneer in revitalizing the traditional form of mediation in the modern society. However, I'm a little anxious about two areas. One is that why is there such an emphasis on community litigation, community mediation? And the moment you give so much of focus on community mediation, it sounds as if, hey, listen, I mean, as if the courts are saying that, listen, these are issues to be dealt with as a matter of charity. So get going within your community, get it sorted. We aren't really concerned. That in many ways, therefore, promotes mediation as a concept of social activism. Now, to a huge number of people, like you yourself said that you are a private mediator, private mediators aren't really social activists. They are engaging, they have a certain skill set, and they are professionally competent to resolve disputes or conflicts without the parties getting into the judicial or the litigation process. Now, what's very surprising is that being the hub and center of most businesses around the world, how is it that the corporates or the industry hasn't really adopted mediation as the way to go process for resolving conflicts and disputes?
Yeah, I have to say that, first of all, the workplace mediation is a very popular mediation in the US, and it is adopted by a lot of workplaces. It does not go through the courts. It is that these systems are put in place, because I've gotten hired to help install mediation systems within organizations. So organizations adopt it. It doesn't get talked a lot about, but they adopt the whole system. They may use internal mediators or external mediators, depending on, a lot of them use internal mediators, and they have their own mediators. In fact, the US government, the Department of, actually the Post Office Department, used to have a lot of conflicts. And so they adopted a whole system of mediation, and they use private mediators. And I was one of those for the postal system. They used these private mediators to come in and resolve disputes within the employees, employee to management or employee to employee. So that system is in place. It's also, the government also uses mediators for Homeland Security. And Homeland Security, that's a big one.
But I didn't mean that sort of mediation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What I really meant is the disputes and conflicts that occur between two parties in business. So, example, between disputes between the principal and an agency, between a contractor and a vendor, between, let's say, an e-retailer like Amazon and their vendors. So, I mean, typically those business segments where disputes would end up in courts. So instead of taking the legal process, how active is business and the corporates in engaging mediators to resolve those disputes, and even complex ones, the high value ones? Are they really encouraging that?
I think that business, or what I've observed so far, is that businesses like arbitration because they have greater control and the outcome is more likely to go in their favor. And so they prefer arbitration and they'll go there first. They would go to mediation second, because the corporation will always prefer whatever gives it the strategic advantage. It's in the ordinary citizen would prefer mediation. So again, I think that's a push and pull that we're still dealing with, and we're still trying to look at, how do you get over that? How do you, every corporation is going to go, what's in its strategic advantage? Because why wouldn't they? That's what their nature is.
Okay. Stefan,
their nature is to make money and have that advantage.
Okay. So Lisa, Stefan is here. He's our speaker number 1. And he was in conversation with the beautiful mind speaker number 1.
Hi, Stefan.
Stefan is not listening to us.
He's waving.
Stefan, you want to unmute yourself? Because Lisa really enjoyed your episode.
Yes, I do.
Lisa really enjoyed that. Yeah, she really enjoyed that episode of yours. She told me.
Yes, I did. So nice to meet you, Stefan.
Thank you, Lisa. Nice to meet you too and to follow it. Thank you.
But Stefan, anything to ask her about the culture of mediation, anything in general into the US or otherwise?
No, not for the moment. Probably it will come later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isaac, anything for Lisa? Because I think restorative justice is some. Yeah, Isaac, please.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
Yes, I wanted to find out how mediators are selected at the community mediation centers, and are those outcomes from the community mediation centers enforceable in different states of the US, and how are the enforcement processes from state by state?
Did you get that, Lisa?
No.
Okay. How are mediators selected at the community mediation center? And how are the outcomes enforced if a party fails to honor part of their agreement? And how is the enforcement process from state to state? You didn't pick up all this? I picked it up immediately.
Okay, I got it. Okay. So first of all, and again, different community mediation centers have different approaches, but I've also been a member of the National Association for Community Mediation. So one of the things, and I'm going to say to Prabhat, one of the reasons probably I talk a lot more about community mediation is because I believe in it. It was not necessary if I were not so much a community member and kind of an activist, maybe I would have talked differently. So that's a qualification statement. This is where I am or where I stand. So that's my thing. But one of the things that we do is that we want mediators to be members of the community. So we would choose anyone in the community. What we look for is, do they have the ability to be able to listen to people? And we ask questions about seeing whether they have the capability to listen, to let go of themselves. They're not too opinionated. They don't want to, be judgmental. We don't want those qualities. But any member of the community, from the lowliest to the highest, is invited to be a mediator. and they can take the training for free, which is how I became a mediator, because I said free training, okay, I'll do it. All I have to do is give back one Saturday a month for a year. No problem. You know, instead of paying $3,000, I get it for free. I'm all in. I love free. And so that's how they have the mediators. However, when you're choosing who's going to mediate a case, usually you look at who's been mediating for a while. If it's more complex case, or if it involves a lot more emotion, then we want at least one mediator who has experience. And we do a co-mediation model. Most mediation centers do, so that you are bringing up someone, so that if you're new, you get to co-mediate. So it's a great way to train people or help them be comfortable with the process. So again, I think they look at where are those skills and who would be best to have those skills, but also who would be able to be comfortable in the community. They're working on, because we have a lot of divisions ethnically, racial divisions. You know, who's going to be able to stand? It's not necessary that you would choose somebody who's of the same race, but somebody who's comfortable in that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think the important.
But what I wanted to also find out is that are the parties allowed to choose their own mediator, since you wanted to do co-mediation?
I think, but Isaac, what you do is you type it out in the chat, because your voice is it's cracking up a bit. So just type it in the chat. We'll take it up. You just type the question in the chat.
It's discouraged for the parties to choose their own mediator, because the perception is, and even as mediators in the law, if I know someone beforehand, I will recuse myself from mediating, or I have to take the agreement of the parties, because the belief is that if you know someone, you'll have a bias towards them. And so we want to, remove as many of our biases as possible. It's not like Ken said, you can't remove them all, but you can minimize them. And to minimize that, so it's better that I don't mediate a case of somebody I know, because I'm more likely to either favor them or not favor them because I don't like them. So you have a bias either for or against them in the mediation, and you don't want to have that. So it's better that we mediate with someone we don't know. And so it's better. And so how are the parties going to choose you if they don't know you?
And the important thing is, we don't expect you to tell us everything about what's happening in the US. Definitely, you'll have your part.
Thank goodness, because I don't know everything.
Exactly. No, because I'm telling you, that's why we have more than one speaker from a country, because everyone will be doing a certain type of mediation, or so they'll be exposed to a certain thing. Like with the Brazil situation, Carolina is exposed to a certain type of mediation, so she'll tell us about that. So I think that's okay. So Isaac's question is, you talked about the co-mediation. I want to find out if the parties allowed. Okay, so you answered this. This is answered, Isaac? Okay, this is answered.
Yeah.
It's answered, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They're not allowed to choose the co-mediator. So at the co-mediation model, and again, like in the center where I practice, I often do mediations alone because I'm an old mediator. I've been there so long.
We can see that. We can see that.
But the reason that we like the co-mediation model is sometimes, especially with, we get intense, very emotional disputes. And so if two people, and we allow yelling to be in the table. So if two parties are yelling at each other, it's always nice to have a second person in the room, because sometimes you get exhausted in the middle of their dispute. Sometimes I've had to stand up and put my body in the way so they don't punch each other. Those are the fun ones. And my body's kind of little compared to a lot of those big guys. But if you have a co-mediator, then sometimes they miss something. Sometimes you have to pay attention to everything everyone's saying. sometimes your co-mediator will catch something, like Vikram in the room catches things I don't catch. And so having that co-model really helps that, but it also helps relieve the intenseness of when you're really in the mind of a dispute. It helps to reduce that. And so it's always nice to be able to work with somebody. It takes skill to be able to mediate with someone. We have a process where we make sure that the mediators talk to each other and they agree on how they're going to work together. Because sometimes when somebody makes an intervention and steps on your toes, you want to go, no, you didn't say that. And I've said that to my co-mediators in a mediation.
But Lisa, I think you need to
be with.
You just have to take us through the restorative justice part of it that you're involved in. Can you just tell us about that?
Restorative justice. I love restorative justice, but again, I like the idea of multiple ways to resolve any issue. It's like, why do we choose just one thing? So what I love about restorative justice, again, is that restorative justice says the community should have the power to decide, and the community should have more involvement. And to me, I think this is a great way. I don't think we do away with one system or the other. I think we look at adding to, because every single system has its advantages and disadvantages. And the more ways that we can address an issue, the more things we have to help, I think opens up greater possibilities. And so that's why I like them. And restorative justice says, okay, the justice system is very, it's about, okay, so if a crime happens, for instance, then what happens in the community? If somebody starts stealing stuff in my, community, I'm going to start locking my doors. I'm going to start not trusting my neighbors. Crime involves the whole community. But when the court system takes it over, the community doesn't get a voice. The community doesn't know what happened. Even the victim often doesn't know what happened to the person that, may have injured them. So restorative justice says that you have to look at all of the parties and that you have to involve the community, the victim, and the offender in the whole process. And that will help restore communities so that this lack of trust and these other offsets that happen in the judicial system can be addressed as well. So a lot of those systems are to address that. And again, it's going back to traditional systems, collaborative systems that were there before we had law.
Okay, perfect. So if there's nothing else that people want to ask, we can close the session. Anyone else, anything, please raise your hand or just get into it.
And my disclaimer is everything I say is from my point of view. I'm making the legal disclaimer. Like, I may have been inaccurate in some things, but that's okay.
Okay, so anyway, thank you, Lisa. If there's anything else you want to, closing remarks that you want to tell us about anything larger in terms of the way the culture of mediation is developing or the mindset of the younger lot is developing, anything on that aspect on peer mediation, you want to tell us about that?
Oh, we didn't even talk about peer mediation. That is a really fun one.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's enough right now. And please. I want to thank you. Peer mediation to me is just another way of introducing mediation to our culture and introducing it in schools. It's a big thing in the US right now. A lot of schools have adopted peer mediation and that whole system so that young people now have learned how to mediate. I think it's improving their communication and their perception of mediation. So now they're willing to take things to mediation. So the young people really they're our future. But thank you, Vikram, for doing all of this symposium, because it's wonderful. And thank all of you for coming here and listening to me and being bored for like a whole hour or more than that.